Talk a little bit about the intersection, because to me, this is a fascinating topic. The intersection between science and the role of science in leadership, and then the limits of science and what is outside the realm of science, and how we incorporate both scientific and non-scientific leadership principles and thinking into our thought processes. How do you combine those two areas?
I mean, first of all, I just want to say this is like a way bigger question than people realize.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted that you've asked it to me, because people think it's philosophy, it's metaphysics. Why do we talk about it? But actually, it's every day we are seeing the hard behavioral reality of us not fully understanding this split between scientific and not scientific. And I've deep dived on this. I wrote a book called Spiritual Atheist, which is my attempt to make sense of my own life journey and my philosophical life journey, from scientist to someone who believes in wisdom. And I can deep dive a bit more into what that looks like. But just before I go into it, I do think it's really important, if you're listening to this as a leader who maybe doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about the hard problem of consciousness, which is basically, how does consciousness emerge, or what and how is consciousness, and how does it come out of physical hard stuff like nerves or atoms of carbon, etc. Because every day you are making decisions, every day, like 100,000 decisions. And a lot of us think we're doing it based upon data, but a lot of the time we're not. Because data is incomplete, always incomplete. You never have enough data, but also it's always about the past. But the definition of data is it's about the past. So what has already happened on your website, your app downloads, your consumer reach through advertising, I don't know, whatever you're measuring. And if you make decisions, you have to make them about the future. So you're always using something else. And that's consciousness. But very few of us take care of our consciousness. So we don't keep it liquid and lucid. We let it get clouded up by emotions and dramas and narratives and old assumptions from our boss that we're still living in everyday life. So and if we're upset or challenged, that's where resilience comes in. If we're not resilient, then we don't have a clear consciousness. So we're making poor decisions, even if we think we're brilliant. They're poor quality decisions. They're not in the moment appropriate to this emergent, never been made before decision you have to make right now. Do you email this person or that person, whatever it is? So this is really relevant. So it's as relevant as it possibly can be. So I believe that science is incredible. I love science. I was a scientist. My father was a scientist, studied science. So I'm a big fan of science, but I also discovered the hard way, very personally, that science didn't have a lot of answers for the ironically post-viral condition that I emerged in my body in my 20s, very similar to what seems to be long COVID. It's called chronic pain syndrome or fibromyalgia. It didn't have a lot of answers for recurrent depression, burnout, anxiety, my relationship failures, which are many and not the topic of this podcast. So I discovered that science couldn't really answer a lot of those questions, like how do I have loving relationships? How can I be wise and make good decisions for myself and the world? How do I clear myself out of trauma and pain and suffering? And in fact, psychology, which people think is the science of consciousness, isn't really the science of consciousness, because it's never really been able to study consciousness. What it studies is people reporting back questions through the language, the cognitive lenses, or behavior, or brain scans, but it's not really studying consciousness. And that's really the challenge we've got, is that consciousness, because it's experience of one person, can't be studied scientifically. And this is why, as you said, the hard problem will probably never be solved, and we should probably let go of the need to solve it, because that's actually part of the problem. Is we're trying to use the wrong tool for the wrong experience, phenomenon, medium. So in summary, science is really good at studying one half of the world, which we call matter, which Galileo called primary properties. So size, weight, mass, acceleration, all these sort of things. And it's really good at that. And if we want to know how a virus moves through matter between a mouth and a nose and a lung receptor, science is definitely better than our mate who reads a lot of stuff on the internet. Right? So that's a really good thing for science to do. But if science wants to tell us, is it better to lock down now or in a month's time? We enter what a great philosopher called the is to ought fallacy.
Yeah, that's Hume, right?
Yeah, Hume, exactly right. So science can tell us what is in matter. It can't tell us what ought to be in consciousness, and therefore society, culture, experience, relationship. And this is where the leader gets, what's the word? It's sort of like slammed every day, because we've got science and we obviously want to find the best research, evidence, whatever you want to call it, about the topic, the subject you have to deal with. And then you have to use something else to make your ought decision, your choices around what ought to be.
Yeah.
That's consciousness. That's our feelings, experiences, ideas, beliefs, interactive moments of truth between us, our interbeing, our interdependence. All of that is within consciousness. And science has never been good at that. But the great news is there's another form of science, which people call variously the contemplative traditions, the wisdom traditions, where have been studying that. Stop worrying, what happens? Or if I open my heart, what happens? So we have a tradition for studying the science of individual consciousness, and we call them the wisdom traditions. So you mentioned Buddhism to me earlier, Taoism, meditation, there's a rich array of this stuff.
Philosophy, I would say